later, still later in that festival, in John 9, Jesus said, I am the light of the world. So another ceremony that they did was called the lighting of the lamps. Ezekiel 8:1. In the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day, while I was sitting in my house, and the elders of Judah were sitting before me. Many people think that's the beginning of the synagogue. They had been displaced from the land, several deportations. Daniel was in the first one, Ezekiel was in the second one, but they were in Babylon, they had no temple. And so many people think that that was the beginning of the synagogue. But if you look down, verse 6, so Ezekiel was a contemporary of Jeremiah. Jeremiah's in Jerusalem, Ezekiel's in Babylon. And so the Ruach HaKodesh, the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, kind of picks. He comes to Ezekiel, son of man. That's what he was called there. Ezekiel was called, and he kind of picked him up by the scruff of his neck and spiritually transported him to Jerusalem, to the temple. And he says, son of man, you see what they're doing? Utterly detestable things that the Israelites are doing here, things that will drive me far away from my sanctuary. And then you look down at verse 9, and I saw portrayed over the walls all kinds of crawly things and unclean animals and all sorts of idols of Israel. And in front of them stood the 70 elders of Israel. Well, who's the 70 elders of Israel?
Sanhedrin.
The Sanhedrin. And they were in the temple worshiping idols, drawing idols on the walls of the temple. And so in verse 12 he says, son of man, have you seen what the elders of Israel are doing in the darkness, each at the shrine of his own idol? Then he brought me, in verse 14, then he brought me to the entrance of the northern gate of the house of the Lord, and I saw women sitting there, mourning the god of Tammuz. Then he brought me, on verse 16, brought me to the inner court of the house of the Lord, and there at the entrance to the temple, between the portico and the altar, there were about 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they were bowing down to the sun in the east with their backs toward the most holy place. And he said, verse 17, have you seen this, son of man? Is this a trivial matter for the people of Judah to do these detestable things? So basically in Ezekiel 10, the glory of the Lord, the Shekinah glory, departs from the temple. Verse 10:18. Then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim. Verse 23. 11:23. The glory of the Lord went up from the city and stopped above the mountain east of it. So basically, the glory of the Lord departed. The Babylonians came in and destroyed that temple. Then we have Herod's temple, because the temple in Jesus' day was not Solomon's temple, it was Herod's temple. But the glory of the Lord had not returned to Herod's temple. So the Jews kind of knew that the glory of the Lord was supposed to be there. So what they did in the court of the women is they erected 4 70-foot high lamps, and they took some of the interns, and they went up and they took some of the old clothes of the Levites that they were going to throw away. They put them up there, used the oil, lit the oil, and so they had these lamps. All these lamps. And it said that for the pouring of the waters, the rabbi said that if you had not seen the pouring of the waters, you had not known joy in your life. You cannot even understand joy unless you've seen the pouring of the waters and of the lighting of the lamps. They said that the light from those lamps, there was not a household in Jerusalem that was not lit by those lamps. So let me show you. Here is the court of the women. We don't see the two down here because they're taking it from this angle, but you see the two there. And these brown ones right there are the shofars for the collection. See those right there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 12 of them. 15 steps, and so they would go up, and then there was the lamps at the top. So this was to substitute for the Shekinah glory. The Shekinah glory was not at the temple, so they said, well, we need light. We need, this is the closest we can come to reduplicating the Shekinah glory, because they knew it was supposed to be there, and it wasn't there, so this is what they substituted in its place. And now for the Messianic significance. So the Messianic kingdom will be fulfilled, the Feast of Tabernacles will be fulfilled by the Messianic kingdom. Okay, so the order is important. I'm not a math person, but statistically, getting 7 feasts exactly in a row lined up with Christ's first coming and second coming is statistically significant. So to review a little bit from last time, just a little bit, we talked about how at the end of the Messianic kingdom, the Jews are in, most of the Jews, not all, I mean there are some in Jerusalem, but almost all of them are in Basra. The Antichrist gathers his armies in the valley of Megiddo, conquers, the Jews fight bravely, but Jerusalem falls. At that same time, the Antichrist hears that Babylon has fallen. And he learns that the Jews are holed up at Basra. So the army turns, they go to Basra, they encircle Basra. They're about ready to wipe all the Jews out, Hitler's final solution. And the Jews cry out. Now, if you look at Hosea 6, it says, "Come." So this pictures the very end of the Great Tribulation, as the Jews realize they don't have any chance against the armies of the Antichrist. Come, let us return to the Lord. And so just as the Jewish leadership rejected Christ, they will need to invite him back. And so they will cry, "Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces during the Great Tribulation, but he will heal us. He has injured us during the Great Tribulation, but he will bind up our wounds. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the 3rd day, he will restore us." So for 2 days, the Jews are crying out for him to come back. On the 3rd day, we have Isaiah 63. The Lord returns. On your handouts for this week, I have included a lot of things, but one of them is the 8-stage campaign of the Battle of Armageddon, because it goes in stages. In 2 Thessalonians 2:8, when Paul is talking about the man of lawlessness, and he says, "And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will overthrow with the breath of his mouth and destroy the splendor of his coming." So the first casualty of the battle of the 8-stage campaign of Armageddon will be the Antichrist. Then, as it says in Isaiah 63, Isaiah says, why are your clothes stained crimson? And he says, in my own strength, I did battle, and their blood stained my garments. And we learned that the armies of, if you can imagine, the armies of the world trying to fight God, but then it says that the blood and gore will rise up to the horse's bridle, and it will go from there to up the valley of Jehoshaphat back to Jerusalem. And then Christ will end up, the 8th stage ends with him putting his feet on the Mount of Olives. He doesn't come to the Mount of Olives, he comes to Basra, but he ends up on the Mount of Olives. I will give you in the handouts a handout called the Dispensation of the Messianic Kingdom. And actually, I got all this stuff, the way of doing this, from Arnold Fruchtenbaum, who was kind of my mentor, although I don't know him. I met him one time, but in the 1980s. But for each of the dispensation, he says there's a key person, man's responsibility, a test, a failure, judgment, and grace. So for the Messianic Kingdom, the key person will be the Messiah, because he'll bring in a new dispensation. The responsibility then will be for each person to receive Messiah and the righteousness and his atonement through his blood. Now you have to understand there's going to be a lot of unsaved people. Many, there's going to be death in the Messianic Kingdom. There's going to be unsaved people in the Messianic Kingdom. And so people will need to accept Christ in the Messianic Kingdom. And some, just astoundingly reject Christ. I don't understand how you can live. In Isaiah, I think it's 65 or 66, they talk about those people unsaved will have 100 years to accept Christ. And at the end of 100 years, they will die if they don't accept Christ. But that's the responsibility, to accept Christ during that time. The test will be each person born into the kingdom to personally receive and accept the king. Then failure comes at the end of the millennium. At the beginning, 1,000 years, at the beginning, Satan is bound, he's put in the abyss, locked up for 1,000 years. At the end of the 1,000 years, he's let go, and he leads a rebellion. And as many rebel, their sin will be during the Messianic Kingdom. Believers will rule and reign with Christ. We don't know exactly how that will work, really. But people will not be able, like an unbeliever may want to kill somebody, and they may have that desire in their heart, but they won't be able to carry it out. I don't know if believers will be there, the Lord will show up. I don't know how that works, but they won't be able to carry it out. But at the end of the millennium, that restraint will be kind of lifted from them, and they will be able to carry out their sinful desires. And so there's this rebellion, and it's like the sands of the sea that will rebel. So at the end of that time, the armies of the world, the Antichrist, Satan still try to battle God. How stupid do you have to be to try to think you can fight against God and win? But they do. It's put down. And then there's the Great White Throne Judgment, which I have also included in your handouts.